During the several centuries following Plato's death in the mid-4th century BC, a continuing stream of philosophers had developed his thought by focusing on and amplifying its metaphysical and religious aspects. In the course of this development, the highest transcendent principle began to be called the One. New emphasis was placed on the flight from the body as necessary for the soul's philosophical ascent to the divine reality. The forms began to be located within the divine mind. An increased concern was shown for the problem of evil and its relation to matter. This stream found its culmination in the 3rd century AD, in the work of Plotinus, who, by integrating a more explicitly mystical element into the Platonic scheme, while incorporating certain aspects of Aristotelian thought, formulated a Neoplatonic philosophy of considerable intellectual power and universal scope. In Plotinus, Greek rational philosophy reached its endpoint and passed over into another, more thoroughly religious spirit, a super-rational mysticism. For in Plotinus' thought, the rationality of the world and of the philosopher's quest is but the prelude to a more transcendent existence beyond reason. The Neoplatonic cosmos is the result of a divine emanation from the Supreme One, which is infinite in being and beyond all description or categories. The One, also called the Good, in an overflow of sheer perfection produces the Other, the created cosmos in all its variety, in a hierarchical series of gradations moving away from the ontological center to the extreme limits of the possible. The first creative act is the issuing forth from the One of the divine intellect or nous, the pervasive wisdom of the universe, within which are contained the archetypal forms or ideas that cause and order the world. From the nous comes the world soul, which contains and animates the world, is the source for the souls of all living beings, and constitutes the intermediate reality between the spiritual intellect and the world of matter. The emanation of divinity from the One is an ontological process, which Plotinus compared to the light that moves gradually outward from a candle until it at last disappears into darkness. The several gradations, however, are not separate realms in a temporal or spatial sense, but are distinct levels of being, timelessly present in all things. The three hypostases, One, intellect, and soul, are not literal entities, but rather spiritual dispositions, just as the ideas are not distinct objects, but rather different states of being of the divine mind. The material world, existing in time and space and perceptible to the senses, is the level of reality furthest from the unitary divinity. As the final limit of creation, it is characterized in negative terms as the realm of multiplicity, restriction, and darkness, as lowest in ontological stature, holding the least degree of real being, and as constituting the principle of evil. Yet it is also, despite its deep imperfection, characterized in positive terms as a creation of beauty, an organic whole produced and held together by the world soul in a universal harmony. It imperfectly reflects on the spatio-temporal level the glorious unity and diversity that exists on a higher level in the spiritual intellect's world of forms. The sensible is a noble image of the intelligible. Although evil exists within this harmony, that negative reality plays a necessary role in a larger design, and ultimately affects neither the perfection of the One nor the well-being of the philosopher's highest self. Man, whose nature is soul and body, has potential access to the highest intellectual and spiritual realms, though this is dependent on his liberation from materiality. Man can rise to the consciousness of the world soul, thereby becoming in actuality what he already is potentially, and thence to the universal intellect. Or he can remain bound to the lower realms. Because all things emanate from the One through the intellect and the world soul, and because the human imagination at its highest, participates in that primal divinity, man's rational soul can imaginatively reflect the transcendent forms, and thus, through this insight into the ultimate order of things, move toward its spiritual emancipation. The entire universe exists in a continual outflow from the One into creative multiplicity, which is then drawn back to the One, a process of emanation and return always moved by the One's superfluity of perfection. The philosopher's task is to overcome the human bondage to the physical realm by moral and intellectual self-discipline and purification, and to turn inward to a gradual ascent back to the Absolute. The final moment of illumination transcends knowledge in any usual sense, and cannot be defined or described, for it is based on an overcoming of the subject-object dichotomy between the seeker and the goal. It is a consummation of contemplative desire that unites the philosopher with the One. Thus, Plotinus articulated an elaborately coherent rationalist and idealist metaphysics which found its fulfillment in a unitary mystical apprehension of the supreme Godhead. With confident and meticulous precision, and in often startling beautiful prose, Plotinus described the complex nature of the universe and its participation in the divine. Basing his philosophy on the Platonic doctrine of transcendent ideas, he then added or drew out several new defining features: teleological dynamism, hierarchy, emanation, and super-rational mysticism. In this form, Neoplatonism became the final expression of classical pagan philosophy, and it assumed the role of Platonism's historical carrier in subsequent centuries.